The chaos that erupted in the square lasted precisely 4 minutes before the first semblance of order reasserted itself. Constable Edmund Graves, a methodical man of 52 who had served Thornfield for nearly 3 decades, was the first to act with decisive authority. He raised his voice above the din of confused murmuring and tearful exclamations, instructing the crowd to remain in the square whilst he investigated the bell tower. His deputy, young Sergeant Malcolm Foster, a nervous man prone to perspiration in moments of stress, was dispatched to ensure that no one entered the church building itself. Miss Marple watched all of this with the detached interest of an observer at a particularly intriguing play. She did not rise from her bench, did not push forward with the morbid curiosity that motivated most of the crowd. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her knitting lying abandoned across her lap, and studied the faces of those around her with the thoroughness of a scholar examining ancient texts. Faces, she had learned over a lifetime, revealed far more than words ever could. They revealed shock, certainly, genuine shock in most cases. But they also revealed something else, something far more subtle and infinitely more revealing. The absence of shock in places where it ought to have been present. It was Eleanor Hartley's face that caught her attention first. The choir director stood near the church steps, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth, her expression one of distress. Yet her eyes, those intelligent, sharp eyes that Miss Marple had observed directing the choir with military precision, held something other than surprise. There was a flicker of something that might have been calculation, quickly masked by fresh tears. Interesting, Miss Marple thought. Quite interesting indeed. 15 minutes passed. The crowd grew restless, their initial shock giving way to speculation and, inevitably, to gossip. People huddled in small clusters, their voices low and urgent, constructing theories with the enthusiasm of amateur detectives. The bell had been defective, some suggested. Perhaps the vicar had lost his grip on the rope and created the extra rings in his struggle to control it. Others proposed more sinister explanations. An accident, yes, but what kind of accident involved a person screaming from a bell tower? And where, precisely, was the vicar? This last question hung in the frigid air with increasing weight. The Reverend Thomas Whitmore, vicar of St. Mary Mead for the past 7 years, was nowhere to be seen. His wife, Margaret, had moved towards the church doors twice, only to be gently but firmly redirected by Sergeant Foster, who remained at his post with the determination of a soldier defending a fortress. The situation was beginning to acquire a distinctly ominous quality. Constable Graves emerged from the church 30 minutes after he had entered, and his grave expression immediately silenced the assembled crowd. He made his way towards Mayor Richard Blackwood, a portly gentleman with political ambitions that extended well beyond the confines of a small village. Whatever Graves said to him caused Blackwood's already florid complexion to drain of color. Margaret Whitmore let out a sound, not quite a scream, but something close to it, and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder. It was this sound, and the sight of it, that caused Miss Marple to rise from her bench with the steady deliberation of someone accustomed to moving through life at her usual pace. She gathered her knitting into her carpet bag and began, very slowly, to make her way toward the church. Few people noticed her departure. Those who did gave it no particular thought. Miss Marple had become, over the decades, rather invisible to most people. An old woman, harmless and unremarkable, a fixture of village life no more worthy of attention than the church itself. Constable Graves was attempting to herd the crowd back toward the high street, his expression carefully neutral, his words carefully chosen to impart information whilst obscuring the full nature of the situation. There had been an accident in the bell tower, he announced. The vicar had apparently fallen whilst performing his ceremonial duties. An ambulance had been called. Everything would be handled with appropriate discretion. There was no danger to the crowd. They should return to their homes and await further information. But Miss Marple, reaching the church steps as Graves was delivering this abbreviated explanation, caught sight of something that had escaped the notice of everyone else. On the threshold of the church door, Caught in the wood where the frame met the door itself was a small scrap of cloth. It was deep blue in color, the shade of a particularly distinctive wool, and it appeared to have been torn away with considerable force. She paused, her pale eyes studying the fragment with the intensity of someone examining an ancient manuscript, and then continued on her path toward the church with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who had nowhere in particular to be and all the time in the world in which to get there. Behind her, the crowd began to disperse, heading back toward the safety of their homes, eager to escape the cold and the uncertainty that now hung over Thornfield like a shroud. Miss Marple, however, was only just beginning to pay attention. Constable Graves intercepted Miss Marple before she could cross the threshold, his weathered face creasing with the practiced politeness that came from years of managing village affairs with minimal fuss. He gently but firmly suggested that the church would be closed to visitors, pending a full investigation, and that Miss Marple would find herself far more comfortable at home, perhaps with a warm cup of tea to settle her nerves following the distressing incident. Miss Marple, who had observed Graves manage similar situations with varying degrees of competence over the years, accepted his suggestion with gracious acquiescence. She allowed him to guide her back down the steps, all the while maintaining the demeanor of a concerned but ultimately undemanding elderly woman. What Graves did not observe, preoccupied as he was with damage control and the impending arrival of Detective Inspector Richard Charlton from the county police, was that Miss S. Marple had already committed the position of that blue cloth fragment to memory with photographic precision. She had also noted several other details that would have struck her as significant, had she possessed any reason to believe that this was anything more than a tragic accident. The position of the ambulance in the square, unusual, as though the driver had been told to arrive, but not to be too conspicuous. The particular way that Eleanor Hartley had clutched her handbag against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. The fact that Timothy Ashford from the post office had not been present in the square at all, despite his regular afternoon routine. By the time the local constabulary had secured the church and the curious onlookers had dispersed to their homes, the winter sun was already descending toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Thornfield's snow-covered street. Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering darkness, her feet finding the familiar path with the confidence of long habit. Her cottage, Rose Cottage, as it had been christened by its previous owner, sat at the edge of the village proper, a small but meticulously maintained dwelling surrounded by a garden that reflected the seasons with mathematical precision. Once inside, she hung her coat upon its appointed hook and set about preparing a light supper with the same methodical attention she brought to all aspects of her life. Boiled eggs, toast with butter and marmalade, a pot of Darjeeling tea. Nothing elaborate, nothing demanding. Her dinner, like her life, followed patterns that had proven their worth through years of application. It was whilst she was arranging these items on her small dining table that her telephone rang, an unusual occurrence as her circle of acquaintances understood that she preferred to receive visitors in person when circumstances permitted. It was Mrs. Eleanor Hartley on the other end of the line. Her voice carried the particular quality of forced composure that typically concealed considerable inner turmoil. "Miss Marple," Eleanor began, her words emerging in a rushed tumble, "I do hope I haven't caught you at an inconvenient moment. It's simply that, well, I felt I ought to speak with someone, and your name came to mind immediately. You've always been so understanding about village matters, so sensible about human nature and all of its complexities." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. Eleanor Hartley, in all the years that Miss Marple had known her, had never sought her counsel on personal matters. Eleanor was precisely the sort of woman who preferred to manage her own affairs, who viewed the sharing of emotional burdens as a weakness rather than a natural part of human connection. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying the gentle warmth that had encouraged confessions from countless villagers over the decades. "What troubles you?" There was a pause, filled with the sound of Eleanor's breathing, with the weight of words that had not yet found their way into speech. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something about the vicar," she said. "About Reverend Whitmore. Something that, well, something that the police mustn't discover, or at least not from me. You see, Miss Marple, there are things in this village that run much deeper than anyone suspects. The Reverend wasn't the man everyone believed him to be, and I genuinely fear, that his death this afternoon was not entirely the accident that Constable Graves seems to believe it was." The line crackled with static, and Miss Marple found herself gripping the telephone receiver with slightly more force than her usual composed demeanor typically permitted. Here, then, was the thread that would unravel everything. Here was the moment when a Christmas festival murder would cease being an inexplicable tragedy and transform into something far more complex and infinitely more revealing about the nature of the village she had called home for so many decades. "Tell me everything," Miss Marple said quietly, "beginning from the very beginning and leaving out no detail, however insignificant it may seem." Eleanor's confession, when it finally emerged, came in fragments and half-formed sentences, punctuated by long pauses and moments where her composure threatened to crumble. "Entirely." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her needles having resumed their steady rhythm as she worked on her charity scarf, a habit that tended to put anxious callers at ease, as though the mundane click, click, click of knitting needles somehow legitimized the sharing of uncomfortable truths. The story that emerged was one of private betrayal wrapped in the trappings of ecclesiastical respectability. 6 months prior, when Reverend Whitmore had arrived in Thornfield, easy, and with his quiet demeanor and his impressive credentials, Eleanor had found herself increasingly drawn to his counsel. Her husband, Gerald Hartley, had passed away 4 years earlier, leaving her a widow of considerable means but limited companionship. The vicar had been sympathetic, attentive, and, this was the crucial detail that Eleanor struggled to articulate, rather more interested in the particulars of her financial situation than seemed entirely appropriate for a man of the cloth. "He asked me questions," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "About my investments, about my property holdings, about whether I had made a will. At first, I thought it was merely pastoral concern, the sort of thing a good vicar might do for his parishioners. But then—" She paused, and Miss Marple heard the sound of Eleanor drawing a shaky breath. "Then he began to suggest that I ought to consider the church as a beneficiary of my estate. He was so persuasive, Miss Marple. He spoke about legacy and spiritual investment, about how a woman of my station and means had a moral obligation to ensure that her wealth served a greater purpose after her death." Miss Marple's needles continued their mechanical dance, though her mind had begun to construct patterns far more intricate than any knitting pattern could encompass. Vicar with an unseemly interest in parish finances, a lonely widow with substantial means. The combination was not particularly novel in the annals of human misbehavior, but it was certainly suggestive. "I was beginning to consider it," Eleanor continued, her words now tumbling out with gathering urgency, "when I discovered something quite by accident. I was volunteering at the church office, filing papers, and I found correspondence, letters between the vicar and a solicitor in London. They were discussing trusts, Miss Marple. Trust that he was establishing in his own name, ostensibly on behalf of various charitable organizations. But the organizations don't exist. I checked. I contacted the addresses listed, and they're all abandoned properties or commercial fronts." The full scope of Reverend Whitmore's deception began to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind, with the inexorable logic of a theorem being proven. The vicar was not merely a man of questionable ethics. He was a practiced fraud, a con artist who had exploited his position and the trust inherent in his collar to extract money from vulnerable parishioners. "When did you confront him about this discovery?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor admitted. "I was angry, Miss Marple. Truly angry. I showed him the correspondence and told him I would expose his schemes to the bishop. I said I had already consulted with a solicitor of my own and was prepared to press charges if necessary." "And how did the Reverend respond?" There was a long silence on the other end of the telephone line. Miss Marple could almost see Eleanor wrestling with the decision of how much to reveal, how much truth could be safely entrusted to an old woman with a reputation for discretion. "He was remarkably calm," Eleanor finally said. "That was what frightened me most, I think. He didn't deny anything. He didn't attempt to justify his actions. He simply sat there in his study, and he said that I should consider very carefully what would happen to my reputation if it became known that I had been vulnerable enough to be targeted by such a scheme. He suggested that society tends to blame the victim for their own gullibility. He implied that if I pursued the matter, he would ensure that every detail of my humiliation would become common knowledge." Miss Marple set down her knitting, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, her pale blue eyes opened to their fullest extent, registering the magnitude of what Eleanor had just revealed. "He was blackmailing you," Miss Marple stated, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "And today, Miss Marple, when I heard that bell ring for the 4th and 5th time, I felt a strange sort of relief. I know that's shameful to admit, but it's true. I felt relieved that the man who had been threatening to destroy my reputation would never be able to do so. And now, I'm terrified that my relief will be interpreted as motive." The connection between Eleanor's confession and the circumstances of the vicar's death suddenly acquired a terrible clarity. A man engaged in blackmail and fraud had fallen from a bell tower on the very day he had been scheduled to be exposed. And Eleanor Hartley, far from being a grieving parishioner mourning an unexpected tragedy, was a woman who had possessed both motive and opportunity. "Have you told anyone else this?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "No one," Eleanor said. "Only you." After Eleanor had disconnected the telephone line with a trembling farewell, Miss Marple sat in her small cottage parlor for nearly 20 minutes without moving. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint crackle of the fire in the grate. Her knitting lay abandoned on the arm of her chair, needles still threaded through half-completed rows. Outside, the village had settled into the peculiar stillness of a winter evening, snow beginning to fall once more in soft, silent flakes that accumulated without sound or fan. Fair. Miss Marple's mind, however, was anything but still. She turned the facts over and over, examining them from every conceivable angle, looking for inconsistencies and contradictions that might illuminate the truth buried beneath the layers of human deception. Eleanor Hartley possessed motive, certainly, but motive alone did not constitute guilt. In Miss Marple's considerable experience with human nature, she had learned that the most obvious suspect was frequently the least culpable party, precisely because obvious suspicion was so easily manufactured by those with something to hide. She rose from her chair with the deliberate care of someone accustomed to managing the minor rebellions of an ailing body, and moved to her writing desk, a small mahogany table, positioned near the window where natural light could illuminate her correspondence. From its uppermost drawer, she withdrew a sheet of quality writing paper and her fountain pen, the one her nephew Raymond had given her for her 80th birthday. She had learned long ago that the process of writing clarified thought in ways that mere contemplation could not achieve. At the top of the page, she wrote a single name, Reverend Thomas Whitmore. Beneath it, she began to construct a meticulous list of facts and possible observations, each one carefully verified against her memory and her knowledge of the village. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, age 43, had arrived in Thornfield approximately 7 months prior. Before his appointment to St. Mary Mead, he had served in 3 different parishes over the course of 12 years. Miss Marple, whose correspondence with distant cousins and former neighbors extended to virtually every corner of England, had made inquiries about his previous postings. What she had discovered was interesting. He had spent an average of 4 years in each parish before moving on to the next opportunity. The reasons given for his transfers had been vague, seeking new challenges, desiring a different environment, feeling called to serve a different community. But what struck Miss Marple as significant was that in 2 of those 3 parishes there had been controversies involving missing parish funds or allegations of impropriety that had never quite been fully resolved before his departure. She paused in her writing and considered the implications of this pattern. Here was a man who had cultivated a carefully constructed identity, a man who moved between communities with the deliberate planning of a chess player positioning pieces across a board. He had chosen Thornfield, Miss Marple suspected, not because he had felt genuinely called to serve there, but because he had identified it as a suitable hunting ground. A small village with limited financial oversight, populated with wealthy widows and elderly parishioners who possessed both trust and disposable income. Eleanor Hartley would have appeared to him as an ideal target, intelligent enough to be convincing, but lonely enough to be vulnerable. Yet something in Eleanor's account did not align perfectly with what Miss Marple knew of human behavior under extreme stress. When a person who had been successfully blackmailed for 3 weeks suddenly discovered that their blackmailer had died, their initial emotion would indeed be relief. But Eleanor's relief had seemed too complete, too certain. The woman had sounded not merely relieved, but almost as though she had been expecting this outcome, as though the vicar's death had confirmed something she had already anticipated. Miss Marple set down her pen and looked toward the window. Snow continued to fall, accumulating on the garden path and the stone walls that surrounded her property. Somewhere in that snow-covered village, Detective Inspector Charlton would be conducting his preliminary investigation. Constable Graves would be taking statements. The machinery of official justice would be grinding forward with its characteristic mixture of thoroughness and oversight. And somewhere in that same village, Miss Marple suspected, was a person who had murdered Reverend Thomas Whitmore, and had done so in such a way as to make it appear an accident. The question was not whether the death was murder. Miss Marple was already quite certain it was. But rather, who among Thornfield's inhabitants had possessed both the motive and the opportunity to push a blackmailing vicar from a church bell tower on an afternoon when dozens of people could hear the consequences of his fall. There was a soft knock at her cottage door, so quiet that she almost missed it. Miss Marple glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was nearly 9:30 in the evening, a most unusual hour for a social call. She rose with deliberate slowness and made her way to the door, where she found Timothy Ashford from the post office standing in the stool, his face pale beneath the faint light that spilled from her hallway. His hands were trembling, whether from cold or anxiety, Miss Marple could not initially determine. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about something terrible, something that no one else can possibly understand." Miss Marple stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for him to enter. As he crossed the threshold, trailing snow behind him, she noticed something that made her pale eyes narrow with interest. There was a small tear in the fabric of his coat sleeve, and the exposed thread was deep blue in color. Miss Marple offered Timothy a seat in her parlor, with the practiced hospitality of someone accustomed to receiving unexpected visitors at all hours. She settled him into the chair nearest the fire, noting with the clinical precision of long observation that he possessed the particular posture of a man carrying an unbearable weight. His shoulders curved inward as though attempting to contain something that threatened to burst from his chest. His fingers, when he accepted the cup of hot cocoa she prepared for him, trembled with such violence that he required both hands to steady it. "Take your time," Miss Marple said gently, resuming her seat across from him. "There is no hurry, and I find that truth tends to emerge most clearly when one is not forced to rush its articulation." Timothy was 28 years old, unmarried, and had worked at the post office for the better part of a decade. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and competent young man, the sort of person who attracted remarkably little attention from the village's more gossipy inhabitants. Miss Marple had noted, however, that he had recently acquired a certain nervousness about his person, a tendency to glance over his shoulder when walking through the village, a habit of arriving at locations through circuitous routes rather than the most direct path. These were the subtle signs of someone carrying a secret, someone whose conscience was beginning to wage war against his capacity to maintain deception. "The vicar," Timothy began, then stopped, his throat working as though the words had become lodged somewhere between his mind and his mouth. He took a long drink of the cocoa, gathering whatever reserves of courage he possessed. The vicar has been... He has been exploiting people in this village, Miss Marple. Not just Eleanor Hartley, though I know about that situation. He has been systematically extracting money from at least a dozen households through various schemes, false charities, supposed investment opportunities, supposed counseling fees that were actually disguised blackmail payments. Miss Marple listened without comment, though her pale eyes registered every nuance of Timothy's revelation. She had suspected as much from Eleanor's account, but hearing it, confirmed by another source, suggested that the Reverend's criminal enterprise had been far more extensive than even Eleanor had comprehended. "Why are you telling me this?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Timothy set down his cup with such force that some of the cocoa sloshed across the rim onto the saucer. "Because I was one of his victims," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of confession. "Because the vicar discovered something about me. Something personal, something that would have destroyed my reputation had it become public knowledge. He used that knowledge to extract money from me for months, and I was too ashamed, too frightened to tell anyone. And then today, when I heard that he had fallen from the bell tower, I felt..." They broke off, unable to continue. "You felt relief," Miss Marple supplied gently, "as did Eleanor Hartley, as, I suspect, did several other residents of this village." Timothy's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "How did you—" "I am an old woman who has spent many decades observing human nature," Miss Marple interrupted, not unkindly. "I have learned that when a person dies under circumstances that appear accidental, and when that death relieves multiple individuals of considerable distress, one must consider the possibility that the death was not, in fact, accidental." "You think someone killed him?" Timothy whispered. "I think it is quite possible," Miss Marple acknowledged, "though I have not yet determined who or precisely how. The bell tower, you see, is accessible only through the church itself. Someone would have had to enter during the ceremony, climb the stairs, and position themselves in such a way as to push the vicar at the precise moment when his attention was as focused on the bell rope. It would have required not merely opportunity, but also a very particular knowledge of timing and the vicar's habits." Timothy rose abruptly from his chair, agitation suddenly animating his previously sluggish movements. "That's why I came to you," he said urgently. "Because there's something you need to know. Something that the police will eventually discover, and when they do, suspicion will fall on the wrong person, on someone who is innocent." "Tell me," Miss Marple said. Timothy moved toward the window, ostensibly to look out at the snow. But Miss Marple understood that he was seeking the courage to articulate whatever truth he had come to share. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "At 10 minutes before 3 o'clock, just before the bell ceremony was to begin, I saw someone entering the church through the side door. Someone who had no business being there, who would have had to climb to the bell tower to accomplish their purpose. I recognized them immediately, Miss Marple. I knew exactly who they were." "And who was that?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Timothy turned from the window, and in his eyes was the expression of a man trapped between loyalty and conscience. "It was Margaret Whitmore," he said quietly, "the vicar's wife, and she was carrying something in her hands, something heavy and dark, which she held tightly against her body as she climbed the stairs to the tower. The revelation hung in the parlor air like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment." Miss Marple rose from her chair with a deliberate grace that belied the intensity of her mental activity. She moved to her writing desk and retrieved the sheet of paper upon which she had been constructing her observations, studying it with the focused attention of someone examining evidence at a crime scene. "Margaret Whitmore," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to Timothy. "The vicar's wife. Interesting? Very interesting indeed." Timothy watched her with the desperate expression of someone who had just transferred an unbearable burden to another's shoulders and was experiencing the complicated mixture of relief and guilt that accompanied such transference. "You're not surprised," he observed uncertainly. "You already suspected her." "I suspected that there was more complexity to this situation than the obvious surface suggested," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But suspicion and evidence are quite different propositions, and I have learned never to confuse one for the other. Tell me, Timothy, what precisely did you observe regarding Margaret's demeanor? Was she hurried? Did she appear frightened or determined?" Timothy sank back into the chair, his energy expended by the effort of confession. "She was calm," he said slowly, as though reconstructing the memory piece by piece. "That was what struck me most forcefully. She was moving with purpose, but not frantically. She climbed the church steps as though she had done so 1,000 times before, as though she knew exactly where she was going and what she intended to accomplish. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. This detail confirmed what she had begun to suspect about the true nature of the crime. This was not a murder committed in the heat of passion, not a desperate response to an immediate threat. This was premeditated, planned, and executed with deliberation. Margaret Whitmore had known what she intended to do, and she had done it with the calm certainty of someone acting from absolute conviction. "Why did you not come forward immediately?" Miss Marple asked, her tone remaining gentle, but carrying an undertone of gentle reproach. "Why did you wait until this evening to reveal what you had witnessed?" Timothy's face flushed with shame. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what my being at the church at that particular time might suggest. Afraid of being questioned by the police, of them discovering the nature of my entanglement with the vicar. And afraid, if I'm being completely honest, of what might happen to me if I revealed that Margaret had something to do with his death. Whoever did this, Miss Marple, they had courage. They had conviction. People like that are danger." "People like what precisely?" Miss Marple asked with sharp precision. "People who are willing to destroy themselves rather than submit to being destroyed," Timothy said quietly. "Margaret Whitmore is not a woman of means. She is not an ambitious woman seeking to inherit wealth or escape an unhappy situation through her husband's death. She is simply a woman who married a man she believed to be one thing and discovered too late that he was entirely another. That sort of disillusionment, Miss Marple, can drive people to extraordinary acts." Miss Marple moved to her window and looked out at the snow-covered garden. The flakes had stopped falling, and the landscape had acquired that pristine, untouched quality that only fresh snow could impart. Somewhere out there, in a cottage, somewhere in Thornfield, Margaret Whitmore was likely sitting in silence, contemplating the consequences of her actions. And somewhere else, Detective Inspector Charlton was no doubt constructing a case that would point toward Eleanor Hartley, or perhaps even Timothy himself, as the perpetrator of the vicar's death. The detective would follow the obvious pathways of motive and opportunity. He would discover Eleanor's dispute with the vicar. He would find evidence of the blackmail scheme. And Eleanor, with her considerable intelligence and her desperation to protect her reputation, would likely refuse to adequately defend herself, preferring the shame of suspicion to the humiliation of having her vulnerability exposed in a courtroom. "There is one matter that continues to trouble me," Miss Marple said, turning back to face Timothy. "The piece of blue cloth that was caught in the church door. The fabric appears to be from a distinctive wool, the sort that would be difficult to replace. Have you noticed, Timothy, whether Margaret has recently acquired any torn garments? Any damage to her coat or clothing that might account for such a fragment?" Timothy's expression shifted, becoming strangely evasive. I haven't noticed her wearing anything torn," he said carefully. But Miss Marple observed something in his hesitation, something in the way his eyes flickered away from her gaze. He was lying, or at least withholding some portion of the truth. Not maliciously, perhaps, but deliberately nonetheless. There was some detail about Margaret Whitmore's condition or circumstances that Timothy was choosing not to share, some final piece of the puzzle that he was holding back. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, her pale blue eyes piercing in their intensity. "Timothy," she said quietly, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Did you see what Margaret was carrying? Did you see what she held in her hands as she climbed those stairs? The silence that followed was profound, and in that silence, Miss Marple understood that she had identified the crux of the matter, the single detail that would transform speculation into certainty. Timothy's hands, which had been resting on his lap with careful deliberation, began to tremble again. Miss Marple, observing this physical manifestation of internal distress, remained perfectly still, allowing the silence to extend between them like a stretching wire, taut and expectant. She had learned through decades of village observation that silence was often more eloquent than speech, that the pressure of quiet could accomplish what direct questioning could not. "It was a rope," Timothy finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was carrying a length of rope, not a normal rope, but something carefully coiled, something she had prepared in advance. And there was something else, Miss Marple, something I haven't told anyone, something I scarcely admitted to myself until this very moment. "Continue," Miss Marple said gently. "Margaret's coat was torn at the cuff," Timothy said, the words now tumbling out with increasing urgency. "Her right sleeve, specifically, and the tear was fresh, still showing the raw threads where the fabric had been ripped. I remember thinking it was strange, wondering how she could have damaged her coat so recently when she had been wearing it all morning at the church rehearsal. But I didn't think about it further at the time. I was too frightened, too focused on concealing my own presence at the church." Miss Marple moved to her desk and retrieved the piece of blue cloth that she had carefully preserved in an envelope since discovering it at the church door that afternoon. She held it up to the lamplight, examining its texture and weave with the meticulous attention of a craftsperson assessing materials. "This fragment," Miss Marple said, "is from a wool coat, a distinctive pattern, quite expensive, the sort of garment that would be carefully maintained by someone of limited means. The tear that produced this fragment would have required considerable force. Someone, or something, would have had to catch on the fabric and pull with significant violence to create such a rupture." Timothy watched as Miss Marple moved to her bookshelf and withdrew a volume on practical forensics, a gift from her nephew Raymond, who worked in law enforcement. She had studied this book carefully over the years, finding its contents both illuminating and occasionally relevant to her observations of village life. "When a person falls from a significant height," Miss Marple explained, turning pages with deliberate precision, "they tend to grab at whatever is nearest to them in their final moments. A rope, for instance, or a piece of clothing. If Margaret Whitmore was positioned at the bell tower door when her husband fell, and if she was wearing that blue coat, then the fragment caught in the door frame becomes not merely a clue, but evidence of her desperate attempt to prevent him from falling. Or, more likely, evidence of his attempted grasp as he plummeted downward." "You think she pushed him," Timothy said, not as a question but as a statement of terrible certainty. "I think it is the most logical interpretation of the evidence," Miss Marple replied. "Margaret climbed to the bell tower with a rope. Not to harm her husband directly, but perhaps to threaten him, to force some kind of confession or confrontation. Something occurred in that tower room, Timothy. Some interaction between husband and wife that escalated beyond Margaret's capacity to control. Perhaps he lunged at her. Perhaps she attempted to restrain him with the rope, and in the struggle he fell. Or perhaps, in a final moment of clarity, Margaret made the decision that if she could not save her marriage, she could at least save herself and her reputation from further destruction." Timothy stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You're going to tell the police," he said, and it was not a question. "That depends," Miss Marple said carefully, "on what you are going to tell them. You see, Timothy, you are the only independent witness to Margaret's presence in the church at the critical moment. Your testimony, combined with the evidence of the torn fabric and the circumstances of the vicar's death, would constitute a compelling case for the authorities. But your testimony comes at a cost to yourself, the revelation of your own involvement in the blackmail scheme, the exposure of your secrets." "I understand," Timothy said quietly. I came here knowing that my confession would likely result in my own exposure. I came because it was the right thing to do, because I could not allow an innocent woman to be blamed for something she did not do." Miss Marple studied him with an expression of subtle approval. "Yet you are making an assumption," she said gently. "You are assuming that Eleanor Hartley is innocent of any involvement in this matter. But have you considered the possibility that multiple people might have been aware of the vicar's presence in the bell tower this afternoon? That there might have been more than one person with reason to wish him harm?" Timothy's expression shifted, confusion replacing the certainty he had begun to acquire. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, moving to her writing desk to review her careful notes, "that in my experience with human nature, murder is rarely the act of a single individual operating in complete isolation. Usually, there are layers of conspiracy, conscious and unconscious, willing and unwilling. Margaret may have pushed the vicar from the bell tower, but it is entirely possible that someone else, someone with their own reasons for wanting him dead, positioned the events in such a way as to make his fall inevitable. Someone who knew about the blackmail. Someone who knew about Margaret's marriage. Someone who understood precisely how this moment would unfold." "Eleanor?" Timothy breathed. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps someone we have not yet considered. Either way, Timothy, I believe it is now time for us to have a conversation with Detective Inspector Charlton. But first, I think we should speak with Margaret Whitmore herself." The vicar's cottage stood at the far end of the high street, a neat stone dwelling with ivy climbing its northern wall and a small garden surrounded by a low fence. In the darkness of late evening, with snow beginning to accumulate once more on its roof and windows, it possessed an almost spectral quality, a place seemingly suspended between normalcy and tragedy. Miss Marple, Timothy, and a somewhat reluctant Constable Graves, whom Miss Marple had summoned after a carefully worded telephone call, made their way through the frozen streets at 10:30. Graves had arrived at Rose Cottage with considerable skepticism evident in his weathered features. He had spent the better part of the evening attempting to construct a case around Eleanor Hartley, collecting statements from villagers and building what he believed to be a circumstantial but compelling narrative of motive and opportunity. Miss Marple's suggestion that he accompany her to speak with Margaret Whitmore had been received with the tolerance one might extend to an elderly woman given to fanciful notions. "I don't see what we'll accomplish at this hour," Graves muttered as they climbed the steps to the cottage door. "The woman is in shock. She's been with her mother all evening. Several people can attest to that fact." "I'm not questioning whether she was with her mother this evening," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I am questioning the interpretation being placed upon her presence there. But we shall see what Margaret has to say for herself." The door was answered by Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, Margaret's mother, a woman of 72 with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a protective demeanor that suggested she was prepared to defend her daughter against any and all threats, real or imagined. She regarded the three visitors with considerable suspicion, her expression darkening when she recognized Constable Graves. "Margaret is resting," Mrs. Bishop said firmly. "She has endured a terrible shock, and I will not have her further disturbed by this investigation." "I'm afraid it is necessary," Graves said, and Miss Marple noted a subtle shift in his tone. The constable was beginning to anticipate complications. "There are questions that require answers." Margaret emerged from the parlor before her mother could construct further objections. She was dressed in a black dress, appropriate for a woman newly widowed, though the color seemed to drain rather than complement her pale complexion. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, or perhaps from sleeplessness, or perhaps, and this was the detail that caught Miss Marple's particular attention, from the emotional exhaustion that accompanied the aftermath of violence. "Constable Graves," Margaret said quietly, "Miss Marple, and Timothy, this is unexpected." Miss Marple observed the slight pause before Margaret spoke Timothy's name, the subtle hesitation that suggested recognition of something beyond the ordinary. She filed this observation away alongside the dozen others she had accumulated throughout the evening. "We have some questions regarding the events of this afternoon," Miss Marple began, settling herself into the chair that Mrs. Bishop reluctantly provided, "specifically regarding your whereabouts during the bell ceremony." "I was here," Margaret said immediately. "I was with my mother. We were preparing dinner, discussing the events of the morning. I had no reason to attend the ceremony. My husband's position as vicar required his participation, but mine was purely optional." "Yet your coat shows evidence of recent damage," Miss Marple observed, gesturing toward the garment that hung on a stand near the fireplace. "A tear in the right sleeve, quite substantial, with raw threads still visible. When did that damage occur?" Margaret's eyes flickered toward the coat, then back to Miss Marple's face. "This morning, I believe," she said carefully. "I caught it on a nail whilst arranging decorations at the church hall." "How curious," Miss Marple mused, "because I have a fragment of blue wool, fabric that matches your coat precisely, that was found caught in the church door frame, a door that leads directly to the bell tower stairs. The damage to this fragment suggests it was torn away with considerable force, quite recently, sometime this afternoon." Graves, who had been standing near the fireplace with an expression of growing understanding, suddenly straightened. "Miss Marple, what exactly are you suggesting?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Timothy stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. "I saw her," he said quietly. "I saw Margaret entering the church at approximately 10 minutes before 3 o'clock this afternoon. I saw her uttering a rope. I saw her climb toward the bell tower. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Bishop made a sound. Not quite a word, but an expression of maternal alarm and protectiveness. Margaret's face remained eerily composed, though her hands gripped the edge of her chair with sufficient force to turn her knuckles white. "That is a serious accusation," Margaret said, and her voice carried a peculiar quality, not defensive, but almost relieved, as though some burden that she had been carrying had finally been set down. "Down it is," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Which is why I must ask you, Margaret, whether you pushed your husband from the bell tower, or whether you went to that tower room with entirely different intentions and found yourself forced into action by circumstances beyond your control." Margaret's eyes closed, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears that had nothing to do with shock or performance. "He was going to leave," she whispered. He had been planning it for weeks. He had been extracting money from these people, accumulating funds for his departure. "He was going to abandon me, Miss Marple, leave me here to face the consequences of his crimes, to bear the shame of being the wife of a criminal. And when I confronted him about it in the bell tower, when I begged him to stop, to make it right, he laughed. He actually laughed at me." Margaret's confession emerged in fragments and half-formed sentences, punctuated by moments where she seemed to be observing herself from a great distance, as though the woman speaking these words belonged to someone else entirely. Constable Graves had taken a seat, his earlier skepticism replaced by the focused attention of a man confronting a truth he had not anticipated. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting needles having found their way into her hands despite the gravity of the moment, a habit so ingrained that her fingers worked almost independently of her conscious mind. "I discovered the ledger 3 weeks ago," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden in his study beneath a loose floorboard, records of every person he had manipulated, every scheme he had orchestrated. Eleanor Hartley's name appeared multiple times. Timothy's name was there as well. But there were dozens of others, Miss Marple. Dozens of people in this village and in the villages where he served before, all systematically exploited by a man who wore the collar of a priest and used God's house as a cover for his predation." Mrs. Bishop moved to stand beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The gesture was one of maternal solidarity rather than approval, a mother acknowledging the humanity of her child, even as that child confessed to actions that the law would not. "When I asked him about it," Margaret said. When I demanded that he cease his criminal activity and make restitution to his victims, he told me that I was being naive. He said that these people were weak, that they deserved to be exploited because they were too foolish to protect themselves. He said that our marriage had become nothing more than an inconvenience, and that he had secured enough funds to begin a new life elsewhere with someone far less troublesome than I had become. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. She understood, with the clarity that came from decades of observing human nature, that Margaret's narrative was approaching a critical juncture, the moment where intention transformed into action, where the boundary between contemplation and deed dissolved. "The rope," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell us about the rope, Margaret." Margaret's eyes, which had been fixed on some distant point beyond the parlor walls, refocused on the present moment. "I brought it with me to the bell tower," she admitted. "I had planned. I thought I would force him to confess to his crimes, to write a letter detailing everything he had done. I thought that if I could obtain his confession in writing, I could turn it over to the police and perhaps escape the worst of the scandal. I was foolish enough to believe that threat alone would be sufficient. But it wasn't," Graves said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed. "When I confronted him in the bell tower, when I showed him the ledger and told him that I had made copies, that I intended to expose him, he became different. Not angry, precisely, but cold. Utterly, completely cold. He told me that if I pursued this course of action, he would ensure that I was implicated in his crimes. He said he would claim that I had orchestrated everything, that I was the true architect of the blackmail scheme, and that he had been my unwilling participant. He said that a jury would be far more inclined to believe a respectable man of the cloth than a dependent housewife. The logic was cruel, but devastatingly effective. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as the strategy of a practiced manipulator, someone who understood that threat and counter-threat could be deployed like weapons in an endless escalation of psychological warfare. "He turned his back on me," Margaret continued, her voice becoming almost mechanical in its emotional flatness. "He said that I should return to my mother's house and consider myself fortunate that he was willing to provide me with a modest allowance from his ill-gotten gains. He actually believed that I would accept this, that I would become complicit in his crimes through my silence, that I would betray every person he had victimized simply to preserve my own reputation." "And in that moment," Miss Marple said, not as a question, but as a statement of understanding, "you made a decision." "I made a decision," Margaret echoed. "I raised the rope, thinking I would restrain him, thinking I would force him to comply with my demands. But he turned and saw what I intended, and he moved toward me with such fury in his eyes that I simply reacted. I stepped backward, and he came forward, and when I raised the rope to create a barrier between us, he lunged directly into it. The rope caught him across the chest, and his momentum carried him forward with such force that he simply toppled. Graves had begun writing in his notebook, documenting Margaret's account with the methodical precision of a man performing a task he had performed hundreds of times before. But Miss Marple noticed something in his expression. A subtle acknowledgement that the line between accident and murder was far more ambiguous than the law typically permitted. "He didn't fall because I pushed him," Margaret said, and the distinction seemed important to her. "He fell because of his own violence, his own aggression, his own refusal to accept that his actions had consequences. I was attempting to protect myself, and he interpreted that attempt as an attack." "The fragment of cloth," Miss Marple said quietly. "How did that become caught in the doorframe?" "He reached out as he fell," Margaret said, and her voice broke for the first time. "He grabbed at me, trying to arrest his descent. The rope caught my sleeve, and as he plummeted, the fabric tore away. I heard the sound of it ripping, heard him screaming as he fell, and I simply stood there, watching it happen. I didn't move. I didn't try to save him. I simply stood in that bell tower and let him die." Constable Graves completed his note-taking in silence. the scratch of his pen against paper the only sound in the parlor beyond the faint crackle of the fire. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the particular wearinesses of a man confronting a case that the law would classify neatly but whose moral dimensions remained thoroughly ambiguous. He rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone performing a duty that had become almost unbearably familiar. "Margaret Whitmore," he began, and Miss Marple noted the formal tone that indicated the transition from conversation to official proceeding. "I must ask you to accompany me to the police station for a formal statement regarding the death of Reverend Thomas Whitmore." Margaret nodded, accepting this development with the peculiar calm that comes from having finally spoken an unbearable truth aloud. She rose from her chair and moved toward the coat stand, then paused, her hand hovering over the blue garment with the torn sleeve. "Mrs." Bishop stepped forward and gently guided her daughter away from it, instead retrieving a black coat from the hallway closet, a more appropriate garment for a woman now confronting the consequences of her actions. "There remains one matter," Miss Marple said quietly, and the three individuals who had been about to depart turned to regard her with expressions of curiosity and concern. "A matter that does not quite align with the narrative as presented." Graves frowned slightly. "Miss Marple?" "The rope," Miss Marple continued, rising from her chair with the deliberate grace of advancing age. "You brought a rope to the bell tower with the intention of restraining your husband, Margaret. But where did you obtain this rope? Where, specifically, did you acquire it?" The question hung in the air like a suspended note awaiting resolution. Margaret's expression shifted, revealing a moment of uncertainty that had not been present during her confession. She opened her mouth as though to respond, then closed it again, her eyes moving toward her mother with an expression that suggested the asking of a question for which she did not wish to hear the answer. "That is an interesting detail," Miss Marple said, addressing herself to Mrs. Bishop rather than to Margaret, "because I spent this afternoon making inquiries of the hardware merchant, and he informed me that a length of rope matching the description offered by Timothy was purchased approximately 1 week ago. He recalled the transaction because the purchaser had been unusually specific about the quality and weight of the rope required. He said the customer had been a woman of advanced years, someone who had used rather a particular language in specifying exactly what was needed. Mrs. Bishop's face had gone very still, her protective hand on her daughter's shoulder suddenly becoming something quite different in nature. "Mother," Margaret whispered, "what did you do?" "I did what was necessary," Mrs. Bishop said quietly, and the words carried a finality that suggested she had been waiting a very long time to speak them. "I discovered your husband's ledger the same day you did, Margaret. I found it when you brought me the laundry that needed mending. Read every entry, and I understood precisely what sort of man you had married." Timothy, who had remained silent throughout Margaret's confession, suddenly stepped backward, as though physically distancing himself from this new revelation. "You went to the bell tower," Miss Marple said, and it was not a question, but a statement of certain knowledge. "You climbed those stairs before Margaret did. You positioned yourself in such a way that your presence would not be immediately apparent. And when your daughter arrived, believing she would confront her husband alone, you were already there, already observing, already preparing for the inevitable escalation." "I was prepared to act if necessary," Mrs. Bishop said, her voice steady and composed. "My daughter is not a murderer, Miss Marple, but I am capable of being whatever is required to protect the people I love. When I saw my son-in-law reach toward Margaret with violence in his eyes, when I saw her attempting to defend herself with the rope, I made a decision in that instant. I did not push him, but I made certain that when he lunged forward in his aggression, nothing would prevent his fall." Graves had gone very pale beneath his weathered complexion. "Mrs. Bishop, are you confessing to involvement in—" "I am confessing to standing in a bell tower and observing the consequences of a man's own violence," Mrs. Bishop interrupted calmly. "Whether that constitutes a legal crime is a matter for the courts to determine. But I will tell you this. If you charge my daughter with murder, You will be perpetrating an injustice far greater than any crime committed in that bell tower this afternoon." Miss Marple studied the two women, mother and daughter, with an expression of profound understanding. She had spent 60 years observing Thornfield, watching the intricate ways that love and loyalty twisted themselves around the boundaries of law and morality. She had seen people commit extraordinary acts of both kindness and cruelty, and she had learned that the distinction between the two was often far thinner than society preferred to acknowledge. "Constable Graves," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of accumulated wisdom, "I believe you have your confession. Margaret Whitmore will accompany you for a formal statement. But I would suggest that Detective Inspector Charlton exercise considerable discretion in determining precisely what charges might be most appropriate under these particular circumstances." As Graves escorted Margaret from the cottage, her mother following close behind, Miss Marple turned to Timothy, who remained standing in the parlor doorway with an expression of profound disturbance. "You did the right thing," she said gently. "You came forward with the truth. And in doing so, you prevented an innocent woman from bearing the full weight of guilt that belonged to circumstances beyond anyone's control." Timothy nodded slowly, though his eyes remained troubled. "Did we do the right thing, Miss Marple? Or did we simply destroy a family?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window, where snow continued to fall on Thornfield's sleeping streets, covering the village in a blanket of white that obscured the darkness beneath. "The truth has a way of emerging regardless of our wishes," she finally said. "What matters now is what the village chooses to do with that truth." She gathered her coat and prepared to return to Rose Cottage, leaving Timothy alone in the vicar's cottage to contemplate the complicated nature of justice and the burden that comes with speaking uncomfortable truths. Outside, Thornfield had settled into the silence of late evening, the Christmas festival abandoned, the bell tower dark and waiting. And somewhere in the falling snow, the village began the long process of reckoning with secrets that had been hidden in plain sight all along.